Reborn 1990. My husband cheated on me, so I chose myself and found real love. The matchmaker's words hung in the air like perfumed smoke, sweet and suffocating. Lucy, dear, Jacob Brown is more than just a handsome face. He secured a position at the Railway Bureau once his military service ends this year. A government position, stable, respected, lifelong. Are you certain you want to refuse such an opportunity? I stared at her eager face, weathered by years of arranging other people's happiness, and felt the weight of 2 lifetimes press against my chest. The universe had granted me a second chance, returning me to this precise moment, the day the Browns sent their matchmaker to orchestrate what would become my greatest regret. This time, my answer would be different. I won't meet him, I said firmly. The matchmaker's carefully painted face crumpled in panic. Lucy, please, don't be hasty. Jacob Brown isn't just any suitor. His reputation for integrity precedes him. In a 100-mile radius, you won't find anyone quite like him. Yes, I know. My voice was quiet but certain. I know exactly how many young women dream of him. The matchmaker's mouth fell open, her practiced speech dying on her lips. Something in my tone, perhaps the weight of experience she couldn't possibly understand, made her pause. I closed my eyes, and the memories of my past life rushed in like a tide. Spring 1990. The sterile hospital corridor. The fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and pale. I was 1 month into my medical internship when fate first introduced me to Jacob Brown, though I wouldn't learn his name that night. The incident began with the sound of shattering glass and terrified screams. A man burst into the ward, grief and desperation twisted into rage on his face, a kitchen knife gleaming under the harsh lights. "You heartless doctors!" His voice cracked with anguish. "I'll make you pay with your lives." The knife slashed through the air in wild, erratic arcs. Staff and visitors pressed themselves against the walls or fled, their fear palpable in the confined space. As the only doctor on duty, I couldn't run, though every instinct screamed at me to do just that. My voice trembled as much as my hands when I stepped forward. "Sir, please, we can discuss this." "There's nothing to discuss." Raw grief had transformed him into something feral. "A life for a life." When his bloodshot eyes locked onto me, something snapped. He charged, knife raised, and my muscles betrayed me, refusing to move. The world narrowed to the point of that blade, and I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the bite of steel. Instead, I heard a grunt and the clatter of metal on linoleum. When I forced my eyes open, a broad back filled my vision. A man had materialized between me and death, his powerful hands locked around the attacker's wrist. In that chaos, in that moment balanced between tragedy and salvation, he turned to look at me. His eyes were steady, calming, like a harbor in a storm. "Are you all right, miss?" I couldn't speak. My throat closed with fear and something else, something I wouldn't understand until much later. I managed a shaky nod, and then he was gone, vanishing into the night like some guardian spirit, leaving me with only the memory of those eyes and the debt of a life saved. Finding Jacob Brown proved easier than I'd anticipated. A patient who'd witnessed the knife incident recognized him immediately. "That young man? That's Jacob Brown, old Brown's son. He's a soldier, home on leave to visit family." Such a simple piece of information, yet it would alter the course of my life. When the matchmaker later mentioned his name, I'd nodded without hesitation, a simple gesture that would earn me Jacob Brown's lifelong hatred. The matchmaker was still speaking, her voice laden with enthusiasm. "Lucy, since you've already met him, you know I speak the truth. This match is perfect in every way." She must have sensed victory in my silence, for she pressed on with renewed vigor. But as she spoke, another name emerged from the depths of my memories, demanding attention. I cut her off mid-sentence. "Wait." My voice was steady, measured. The Brown family would indeed make a fine match. I paused, watching confusion cloud her features. But I wished to meet Jacob Brown's older brother, Robert Brown. After showing the matchmaker to the gate, I turned to head back inside, my mind already racing with plans. That's when I heard it, a voice that sent ice through my veins and stopped my heart for a beat. I spun around, and there he stood, Jacob Brown, beneath the ancient pomegranate tree outside our yard. The sight was jarring. Beside him stood Jasmine White, ethereal in her white dress, the woman who would occupy his heart until his dying day. Our eyes met across the yard, and Jacob exchanged a few quiet words with Jasmine. They shared a meaningful look before she departed, leaving us alone with the weight of unspoken histories between us. Jacob approached with purposeful strides, his expression hardened with determination. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Lucy Carter." His voice carried the chill of winter. "This time, I won't marry you. You should abandon that notion entirely." The cold fury in his gaze was familiar. It was the same look he'd given me in my past life, as he watched my downfall with detached satisfaction. But something in his words caught my attention, a subtle tell that changed everything. "This time," he'd said. Combined with my memories of the past, the pieces fell into place with startling clarity. In my previous life, Jacob had still been serving in the military when the matchmaker first approached. Our formal introduction hadn't occurred until 3 months later, during the Laba festival. The implications were staggering. Jacob Brown had also been reborn. His presence here, now, could only mean one thing. He'd come to prevent Jasmine White from marrying another, and in the process, ensure I never became his wife again. I met his cold stare with carefully crafted innocence, my face a mask of confusion. Let him think me clueless. It would serve my purposes better that way. "Who are you?" I asked, eyes wide with practiced innocence. Jacob's composure faltered for a moment, surprise flickering across his features before understanding dawned. "Of course. How could you possibly—" He cut himself off mid-sentence, studying me with newfound intensity. I could read his unfinished thought as clearly as if he'd spoken it. "How could you have been reborn too?" "What about me?" I prompted, maintaining my facade of confusion. "Nothing." Jacob cleared his throat, visibly reorganizing his thoughts. "I'm Jacob Brown. My parents just sent the matchmaker to your house, didn't they?" I nodded slowly, then let recognition dawn on my face like a theatrical sunrise. "Oh, so you're the Jacob Brown the matchmaker mentioned." I made a show of examining him from head to toe, watching discomfort creep into his stance with each passing second. Anxiety crossed his features as he watched me assess him, his brow furrowing with the fear that I might actually find him appealing. "Lucy Carter," he began cautiously. "I came to see if—" "Wow," I interrupted, injecting disappointment into my voice. "The matchmaker said you were 8 feet tall and as handsome as Adonis. How come you look—" I gestured vaguely at his entire person, letting the implication hang in the air. Jacob stood frozen, his carefully prepared speech forgotten in the face of my dismissal. I pressed my advantage, adding a layer of disdain to my voice. "Hey, turns out the matchmaker was just full of lies. What a joke." "What do you mean by that?" The question burst from him, wounded pride evident in every syllable. I had struck a nerve. In our past life, Jacob had been the village's golden boy, the most eligible bachelor for miles around. His looks had opened every door, smoothed every path. His parents had chosen me after seeing my work at the clinic, drawn to my gentle manner and professional dedication. "You didn't know?" I continued with calculated indifference, shrugging my shoulders. "When the matchmaker sang your praises, I was actually quite intrigued to meet you." A flicker of relief crossed Jacob's face, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, only to vanish as I continued. "But now that I've seen you in person, I realize you're just average." I paused, letting each word fall like a pebble into still water. Your looks? Average. Your build? Average. Even your personality seems nothing special. I wrinkled my nose slightly. Honestly, you're not my type at all. I waited a beat, then delivered my coup de grace with a knowing smirk. It's not just this life. I wouldn't marry you in the next life, or the one after that. Jacob's pupils contracted as the deliberate echo of reincarnation in my words hit home. Lucy Carter, you... Jacob Brown, I cut him off, my voice sharp as a surgeon's blade. I believe this is our first meeting, I said pointedly. Please address me as Miss Carter. Jacob's eyes bored into my face, searching for any hint of deception. You're serious about not wanting to marry me? The disbelief in his voice was almost tangible. Of course, I replied without hesitation, punctuating my words with a firm nod. My response left him speechless, his lips pressed into a thin line. I watched the conflict play across his features. He should have been relieved, yet confusion shadowed his expression. I knew why. He had expected tears, protests, perhaps even desperate pleading. Instead, I had delivered complete indifference, shattering his expectations. Good, that's good, he finally managed, nodding as if trying to convince himself. With one last cold glance in my direction, he turned and walked back to where Jasmine White waited. Though I couldn't hear their exchange, her shy smile spoke volumes about her feelings. They walked away together, their silhouettes merging in the late afternoon light. I didn't waste a moment once I returned inside. With quick, decisive strokes, I drafted a formal report about Jacob's unauthorized absence from his military post. Let him deal with the consequences of his impulsive visit. The matchmaker's efficiency proved remarkable. She contacted me about Robert Brown sooner than expected. However, her voice carried disappointment when she called. Lucy, she began hesitantly. Robert declined. He already has someone in his heart. She immediately launched into another pitch for Jacob, but her words faded into background noise as I processed this new information. Robert already had someone he loved. In my previous life, our paths had crossed only twice. As Jacob's half-brother, 4 years his senior, Robert had always been something of a shadow figure in the family narrative. Born to different mothers but sharing the same father, the brothers had lived largely separate lives after their father's remarriage. Robert had moved south with his uncle, pursuing higher education and eventually establishing his own business. His visits home were rare, marked by their brevity. The first time I met Robert was at my ill-fated wedding to Jacob. It had been a brief encounter during the banquet, nothing more than a formal exchange of pleasantries. Later that night, Jacob had been carried to our room, barely conscious from excessive drinking. After the last guest departed, I changed out of my wedding clothes and busied myself preparing hot water to clean him up. Seeking a moment's respite, I stepped into the courtyard, leaning against the cool stone steps. The night air offered little comfort. I hadn't noticed another presence until a deep voice emerged from the shadows, carrying a weight of unspoken regret. I never thought the one he married would be you. Startled by the voice, I looked up into the darkness. There, beneath the ancient locust tree, stood a man whose sharp features caught the wan moonlight. His face held a coldness that seemed to mirror the night itself, yet something enigmatic lurked in his expression. After a moment's hesitation, recognition dawned. Robert Brown. He studied me with an intensity that made me want to shrink back, before murmuring, as if speaking to the night itself, "Why did it have to be you?" The words made no sense to me then. The heavy scent of alcohol reached me, and I dismissed his strange behavior as drunken rambling. As I turned to leave, my movement seemed to draw him forward. Frightened by his approach, I quickly called out, "Big brother!" The formal address acted like a spell, snapping him back to awareness. His eyes swept over my face one last time, lingering as if memorizing something precious and lost. Then he stepped back, creating a careful distance between us, his lips curving into a smile that held more sorrow than joy. "Sister-in-law," he said formally, "congratulations on your marriage. May you both share a long and happy life together." Before I could respond, he melted back into the darkness, leaving me with questions I wouldn't understand until it was far too late. The second time I saw Robert was after Jacob and our son had driven me to my death. My soul, not yet ready to depart, hovered above the scene like a forgotten whisper. I watched as they rushed my body to the hospital, their actions a perfect performance of concern. But when the doctor pronounced me dead, neither shed a tear. Instead, my son's sigh of relief cut through me like winter wind. "Dad," he said, his voice lighter than it had any right to be. "Finally. Now she can't interfere with your plan to be buried with Jasmine in the future." I had thought death would end all suffering, but those words sent a chill through my incorporeal form that made my mortal pain seem trivial. Jacob's responding sigh carried the weight of decades of pretense finally lifted. "Yes, now I can finally be with Jasmine openly," he said, his voice soft with yearning. "I only hope that in our next life, I'll meet you again, Jasmine." Jacob handled my death with the same casual disdain he'd shown during our marriage. From hospital to crematorium to a remote cemetery, my final journey was as lonely as my life had been. No funeral service marked my passing, just a brief message in the family group chat announcing my death, as if reporting the weather. Watching it all unfold, my soul carried only one word: regret. A promise formed in whatever remained of my consciousness. If fate ever granted me another chance, I would never again bind my life to Jacob Brown. Just as my soul began to fade like morning mist, Robert Brown appeared at my grave. He knelt slowly, his aged hands trembling as they reached out to touch my photograph on the cold stone. In that gentle gesture lay more care than I'd known in all my years as Jacob's wife. Robert's aged fingers traced my photograph as he whispered my name like a prayer. "Lucy, Lucy, Lucy, I'm so sorry. I was too late." The revelation struck my fading soul with devastating clarity. Somewhere in this vast world, in a corner of life I had never glimpsed, someone had loved me with an intensity that bordered on agony. "Do you have Robert Brown's address?" I asked the matchmaker the next day. Though puzzled by my request, she proved efficient in obtaining it. I spent the night staring at blank paper, weighing each potential word. As dawn painted the sky, I made my decision. I attached a spare photo from my work ID and wrote a single line. "Hello, Mr. Brown. I am your prospective match, Lucy Carter." After posting the letter, I headed to the clinic for my shift. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. My first patient was Jasmine White. Jacob's absence suggested he had quietly returned to his military post. "Dr. Carter, we meet again," Jasmine said, her tone dripping with false familiarity as she settled into the consultation chair. I gave her a measured look. "We've met before?" In my past life, our paths had crossed rarely, no more than 10 encounters. The first had been on a country road after her husband's death. I'd given her directions, not knowing she was the woman who occupied Jacob's heart. "You don't remember?" Her lips twitched with displeasure at my dismissive tone. "What brings you here? Are you unwell?" I asked, maintaining professional detachment. "Dr. Carter, this isn't about medical matters." Jasmine crossed her legs, radiating unearned superiority. "I'm here to tell you that Jacob loves me. Stop clinging to him." I regarded her as one might view a particularly delusional patient. My silence calculated. She mistook it for submission and pressed her advantage. "Do you think secretly maintaining contact with Jacob's parents behind his back will help? This is the modern era of free love. Jacob has promised to marry me once he returns from service." Her words revealed the absurd misunderstanding. My simple inquiry about Robert had somehow morphed into desperate pursuit of Jacob in her mind. This misconception, however, sparked an idea. a way to ensure Jacob's downfall would mirror my own. I allowed a faint smile to touch my lips. "You're right. I do like Jacob," I admitted softly. "And Jacob's parents have made it clear that no matter how much he loves you, they'll never welcome you into their home." I paused deliberately before the next patient entered almost immediately, her eyes lingering on Jasmine's retreating figure. "Dr. Carter, was that woman here for a checkup? A venereal disease, perhaps?" The question dripped with malicious curiosity. I met her gaze coolly. Doctors are bound by patient confidentiality regarding any condition. When she persisted, I added firmly, "We don't discuss other people's private matters here." The elderly woman settled into her chair, undaunted by my professional rebuff. "You don't have to say anything. I already know." Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a gossip about to unleash her knowledge. "Why do you say that?" I asked, despite myself. She leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice dropping to the practiced whisper of someone who had spread countless rumors. "Dr. Carter, don't be fooled by her pretty face and fancy clothes. She works in a dance hall." She spat the words like poison. How many respectable people work in such places? Men and women coming and going at all hours. Who knows what goes on inside? It's filthy. If I had a daughter like that, I'd beat her to death. The woman's vitriol painted a clearer picture of Jasmine White's world. Now I understood why Jacob's parents refused to accept her. Her profession carried a stigma that no amount of love could wash away in their eyes. The following days passed in relative quiet. I found myself counting time like a prisoner, calculating when Robert might receive my letter. In this era of unreliable post, delivery could take anywhere from a week to a month. As each day passed without response, my confidence began to waver. A month crept by with no word from Robert. Anxiety gnawed at my certainty. Had the letter gone astray? Or worse, had I misinterpreted everything? Perhaps Robert's graveside grief had been for someone else entirely. As doubt threatened to overwhelm me, I made an impulsive decision. I would take leave from work and travel south to confront Robert directly. 3 days later, I stood before the address the matchmaker had provided. The door opened to reveal not Robert, but a fashionably dressed young woman. She greeted me in an unfamiliar dialect before switching to awkward Mandarin. "Who are you looking for?" A wave of nervousness washed over me. "Hi, I'm looking for Mr. Brown." A man's voice called from within the house. "Who is it?" I froze, my voice caught in my throat. My eyes darted to the address slip. It was correct. Then back to the woman before me. My heart plummeted as understanding dawned. "Sorry," I mumbled, already turning away. "I must have the wrong address." The heavy creak of the stairwell door had barely faded when their voices drifted through the wall. Who was at the door? The man's question hung in the air, casual yet tinged with curiosity. "Just a pretty woman," she answered, her voice light and dismissive. "Wrong address, apparently." "Forget it," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "We rarely have the house to ourselves." The door sealed shut with a finality that echoed through the stairwell, silencing their conversation. I sagged against the cold concrete wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. Shame and guilt coiled in my stomach like a serpent. "Lucy Carter," I whispered into the empty space. "You've really outdone yourself this time." But even as I tried to shake off the encounter, my mind betrayed me, replaying that haunting vision. Robert standing at my grave, tears carving paths down his cheeks, his grief as raw as an open wound. Yet here he was, moving forward while I remained tethered to a past that no longer existed. Reality had drawn its line in the sand. Robert had built a new life, and I had no right to disturb its foundations. That evening, I purchased a train ticket home, trying to outrun my own thoughts. Time, as it often does, slipped through my fingers like water, and before I knew it, winter had wrapped its cold fingers around the year's throat. It was then that Jacob Brown, freshly released from his service, returned home like a ghost from my past life. Our paths crossed out. Jacob recovered first, his voice sharp as broken glass. "What are you doing here?" I met his challenge with ice in my veins. "Is your name on the deed to this restaurant?" I countered, arching an eyebrow. His face darkened like storm clouds. "Lucy Carter. Is that how you speak to me now?" 50 years of marriage in my previous life had taught him to expect submission, a lesson I had no intention of repeating. I allowed myself a razor-thin smile. "Jacob Brown, your ego writes checks your destiny can't cash." The truth hit him like a physical blow. His fist clenched at his side, knuckles white with barely contained rage. I could see the familiar impulse to strike flickering in his eyes like a dying flame. But fear was a luxury I'd left behind in my past life. Let him try. One swing would be all it took to end his precious Railway Bureau career. My report was already drafted in my mind, waiting to be unleashed. It was Jasmine White, who proved to be the voice of reason, her hand finding his arm, her silent warning clear as day. Not here. Not now. The tension crackled between us like static before a storm. Jasmine stepped forward, chin tilted upward, positioning herself like a shield between Jacob and me. "Lucy Carter," she practically purred. "I know exactly why you're here. Heard Jacob was back and thought you'd use his parents as leverage for a reunion, didn't you?" A laugh nearly escaped my lips at the sheer absurdity of her deduction. So much for giving her credit for basic intelligence. "Lucy Carter," she continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I never thought you'd stoop so low. Jacob's made it crystal clear. Marriage between you two is never happening. Accept it." As she spoke, I watched understanding dawn across Jacob's face like a slow sunrise, as if this ridiculous assumption suddenly illuminated everything in his narrow worldview. Jasmine's smugness radiated as she delivered her coup de grace. "Save yourself the embarrassment. It won't work." Her hand drifted to her stomach in a gesture so deliberate it might as well have been accompanied by neon signs. The message was clear as day. She was carrying his child. Jacob's oblivious expression told me he hadn't been let in on this little secret yet. "Jasmine, she's not worth our time," Jacob interjected, his impatience evident in every syllable. His hand found the small of her back, steering her away from me as if I were contagious. Jasmine's face melted into sweetness. "Of course, Jacob. Whatever you say." I watched their retreating figures, their faces painted with self-satisfied smiles. Enjoy it while it lasts, I thought. Those smiles will soon enough be washed away by tears. By dawn's first light, the gossip mill was already churning at full speed. Even the cleaning lady couldn't resist sharing the latest drama while going about her morning routine. "Have you heard?" she whispered conspiratorially, her broom forgotten. "Old Brown's son's barely back from service and already knee-deep in scandal. Got some girl in trouble, they say." As I passed by, she called out to me, "Lucy, have you heard?" Playing innocent, I paused. Heard what? The words had barely left my mouth before she launched into her tale, practically vibrating with excitement. "Last night, after you left, Jacob brought that girl home, Jasmine White. Before a single word could leave Jacob's mouth, his father took one look at her and bellowed, 'Get out!' She clapped her hands together for dramatic effect. Poor thing burst into tears right there and then. Jacob, of course," she rolled her eyes, "played the knight in shining armor, shielding her behind him. The argument that followed, you should have heard it. His parents even brought up your name." "Oh?" I kept my voice carefully neutral. "What did they say?" They told him straight up, "Son, you're letting this vixen bewitch you. We'd rather see you with anyone else. Look at Dr. Carter from the clinic. Beautiful, educated." Her voice dropped to a theatrical whisper. "And you know what Jacob said? Dad, Jasmine's the only one for me. If you try forcing Lucy Carter on me, I'd rather die in a car crash today." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jacob's father swayed, his face draining of color as if his son had physically struck him. Even in a private room, such raw emotion couldn't be contained. The commotion drew a crowd of restaurant patrons, their curious faces pressed against the doorway, witnessing Jasmine's theatrical performance as she knelt, tears streaming down her face, every sob carefully calibrated to pluck at heartstrings. "Uncle, Auntie," she pleaded, her voice trembling with well-practiced vulnerability. "I understand your disapproval, but our love," she choked on the words, masterfully playing her role. "Please, give us your blessing." Jacob's mother jabbed an accusatory finger at her, fury emanating from every pore. "You fox spirit! Nothing but a homewrecker!" Jasmine bowed her head in apparent submission, weathering the storm of insults like a martyr. When the tirade finally subsided, she lifted her tear-stained face and delivered her coup de grace. "I'm carrying Jacob's child." The words dropped like a bomb, stunning everyone into silence. Even Jacob stood frozen, his face a picture of genuine shock. Clearly, this wasn't part of their scripted drama. With this revelation, resistance became futile. His parents, trapped by propriety and circumstance, had no choice but to help Jasmine to her feet, ushering everyone inside to discuss wedding arrangements. But in a restaurant buzzing with curious onlookers, such juicy scandals spread faster than wildfire. The cleaning lady was still grinning, savoring the drama, when a nurse appeared at my side. "Dr. Carter, you have a visitor." "Who is it?" I asked, maintaining my composure. "I'm not sure," she replied, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "But he's quite striking, tall, distinguished-looking." My heart stumbled in its rhythm as I stepped outside. There he stood, Robert Brown. Our third encounter across 2 lifetimes, yet his presence still had the power to steal my breath. His sharp features seemed carved from marble, the brown trench coat hanging perfectly from his broad shoulders. Even strangers couldn't help but stare, drawn to his magnetic presence like moths to flame. He closed the distance between us with purposeful strides. "I received your letter," he said without preamble, his voice urgent. Memories of my failed visit south flashed through my mind like lightning. I steadied myself and lied smoothly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, but I didn't send any letter." His eyes widened fractionally. "It wasn't you?" "No," I maintained the facade, though guilt gnawed at my conscience. Must have been my younger cousin playing pranks. I mentally apologized to my non-existent cousin for making them my scapegoat. But Robert's penetrating gaze held mine, unwavering. "They told me you came looking for me a month ago. Is that true?" My carefully constructed lie crumbled like a house of cards, leaving me no choice but to face the truth. "Fine, Mr. Brown," I conceded. "Yes, I sent the letter, and yes, I sought you out. But I didn't know—" "Lucy," Robert cut in, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not married. I don't even have a girlfriend." I froze, words dying on my tongue, but Robert pressed on, as if he'd rehearsed this explanation 1,000 times. "I've kept my distance from family for years, but couldn't sever ties completely. The address they have belongs to my business partner. Those people you met, they're not my family. Your letter, it took a roundabout path to reach me." "How can I be certain?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, weighted with years of accumulated doubt. The pain that flashed across his face seemed genuine, but then again, I'd been fooled before. "You don't believe me?" he asked softly. My silence spoke volumes. This wasn't my first life. That naive girl who trusted too easily was long gone, buried under decades of hard-learned lessons. Robert absorbed my wordless response like a physical blow. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." He turned away, each step echoing with finality. My heart lurched traitorously in my chest as I watched him leave. Then, as if struck by lightning, he spun back around. "Lucy Carter," he called out, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite decipher. "Wait for me. Promise me you'll wait." Before I could respond, he vanished into the sea of faces, leaving me anchored in place, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. 2 days passed in a blur before our paths crossed again. I had just finished my shift when Robert appeared, this time dragging a protesting man by his collar. "Explain," Robert demanded, practically shoving the man forward. The stranger brushed at his wrinkled collar with obvious irritation. "For heaven's sake, you're ruining my shirt!" A familiar face peered around the man's shoulder, eyes lighting up in recognition. "Oh, pretty lady," they exclaimed in halting Mandarin. "We meet again." I blinked rapidly, memories of my awkward visit south flooding back. You're... Robert gestured to the disheveled man. "This is Song Hao, my business partner and friend." Song Hao, having rescued his collar from further assault, offered me a warm smile. At Robert's pointed look, he quickly drew a woman closer to his side. "Dr. Carter, a pleasure. And this is my wife, Mengjia." As if preparing evidence for a court case, he produced their marriage certificate with a flourish. The entire scene bordered on absurd, a grown man proudly waving his marriage certificate like a victory flag while his wife tried not to laugh beside him. Yet watching them, pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. Robert's earlier words took on new meaning, and I found myself fighting back a smile at the lengths he'd gone to prove his honesty. "Wait for me." The words echoed in my mind as I absorbed the magnitude of his effort, flying Song Hao and his wife across provinces, enduring an overnight bus journey, all to prove his sincerity to me. My heart, so carefully guarded until now, was pierced by what felt like the sweetest of arrows. As we sat together, Song Hao unraveled the mystery that had tormented me. My letter, it seemed, had reached its destination within a week of sending. But fate has a peculiar sense of timing. It had languished in a stack of correspondence while Robert was away in Nanyang. It wasn't until his return, during a routine sorting of mail, that he discovered it. Meng Jie had been the key to unlocking the puzzle, recognizing me from the photograph I'd enclosed. The moment Robert learned of my visit, he'd dropped everything to find me, as if racing against time itself. When I turned to Robert, the love in his eyes was unmistakable, pure and unguarded. "Do you believe me now?" he asked, his voice tender with hope. "I do," I whispered, the words carrying the weight of 2 lifetimes. Some truths transcend time. Robert Brown's love for me was one of them. Throwing propriety to the wind, I stepped into his embrace, ignoring the curious onlookers. "Robert, let's get married." The words tumbled out, natural as breathing. Fate, however, had one more twist in store. As we emerged from the Civil Affairs Office, newly registered as husband and wife, we collided with the past. Jacob Brown and Jasmine White stood before us. Jacob's eyes found me first, widening with recognition. "Lucy Carter," then, spotting Robert. "Big brother?" His gaze dropped to our interlocked hands, disbelief etching deeper lines into his face. How are you two together?" Robert's response was instinctive. He drew me behind him like a precious treasure, shielding me from Jacob's scrutiny. Yet unlike his younger brother's obvious agitation, Robert exuded calm authority, releasing a cold laugh that carried years of unspoken history. "Lucy Carter, come here." Jacob's command cracked through the air, frustration bleeding into every syllable. "Explain yourself. Why are you with my brother?" The old Jacob's jealousy of Robert had survived death itself, reincarnating as this raw, misdirected anger. I moved to confront him, but Robert's grip remained steady, anchoring me in place. From my protected position behind him, I fired back. "It's none of your business, Jacob Brown." My defiance seemed to shatter whatever composure he had left. "Lucy Carter!" he exploded. "Have you forgotten? You're my wife!" The words had barely left Jacob's mouth when Robert's fist crashed into his face with surgical precision. Jacob staggered backward, and Robert loomed over him like an avenging angel. "Choose your next words carefully," he said, his voice arctic. "She's my wife." Jacob wiped blood from his split lip, defiance burning in his eyes. But Jasmine's fingers dug into his arm before he could retaliate. "Jacob, don't!" Her urgent whisper seemed to pierce his rage-induced haze. Reality flickered across his face. The memory that I had been his wife existed only in a past life, now nothing more than smoke and shadows. Yet his possessiveness, that suffocating need to control, wouldn't let him surrender gracefully. "I see how it is, Lucy," he sneered, venom dripping from every word. "Couldn't have me, so you settled for my brother out of spite, didn't you?" His delusion that I couldn't exist without him remained unshakable. This time, I stepped out from Robert's protective shadow, meeting Jacob's smugness with steel. "Jacob Brown, do you want to know what you remind me of?" Confusion rippled across his features as I pointed to some dog waste on the roadside. "That." His face contorted with rage. "You're comparing me to—" "No," I cut him off, my voice crystallizing into ice. "You're worse than that." Robert seized the moment with perfect timing. "Darling," he interjected smoothly, "some people aren't worth the breath it takes to speak to them." I turned to him, my lips curving into honey-sweet smile. "You're absolutely right, my love." As we walked away, Jacob's fury manifested in a grinding of teeth that echoed behind us. "Fine," he roared at our backs. "Have it your way, Lucy Carter. If you knew what happened in your past life, you'd regret everything about today." But karma moved faster than his threats. Within moments, officers in crisp uniforms converged on him, credentials at the ready, requesting his presence for an investigation. Meanwhile, Robert had transformed into an ecstatic newlywed, armed with a bag of candies he seemed to produce from thin air. He distributed them generously, announcing our marriage to anyone within earshot. Well wishes rained down like confetti. "Wait, aren't you old Brown's firstborn?" someone called out. "You're back." Though Robert visibly bristled at being defined by his father, he maintained his composure. "Yes, that's me," he replied simply. Another voice joined the chorus. "So the Browns' matchmaker visited Dr. Carter's house for the elder son, not the younger?" The irony hung in the air like sweet incense. Who would have thought old Brown's eldest son would be so handsome? They're perfect together, like a painting come to life. The whispers followed us home as twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of purple. Robert, ever attentive, was already heating water for my feet when we arrived. As he reached for my shoes, I instinctively recoiled. His eyes found mine, questioning. "What's wrong?" Heat crept up my neck as I stammered. They might smell." A ridiculous excuse. My feet were fine. But this tender gesture, so foreign to my experience, left me feeling vulnerable. Robert remained silent, carefully peeling away my socks. Then, in a moment that stopped my heart, he pressed his lips to the top of my foot before lifting his gaze to mine, eyes dancing. "Smells sweet," he murmured. I gaped at him, speechless. "My beloved wife," he chuckled, eyes crinkling with affection. "Everything about you is perfect." As I closed my mouth, still stunned, a thought floated through my mind. Is this what poets mean when they say love transforms everything it touches? But the sweetness of the moment triggered a darker memory. 8 months pregnant in my past life, my belly swollen like a full moon, unable to reach my own feet. I'd approached Jacob with such careful preparation, scrubbing my feet until they gleamed, yet his response had cut like a knife. "You want me to cut your toenails? That's disgusting." Love, or its absence, leaves marks impossible to ignore. Only now, in this second chance at life, did I truly understand the vast gulf between affection and obligation. "Where did you go just now?" Robert's gentle query pulled me back to the present. "Oh, nowhere important," I deflected, then added with clinical precision, "though as a doctor, I should warn you about foot fungus. Kissing feet isn't exactly hygienic." His expression, caught between amusement and surprise at my decidedly unromantic response, was priceless. "Noted, doctor," he said solemnly, though his eyes sparkled with mirth. But Jacob's shadow still lurked in my thoughts, demanding attention. "Robert," I patted the space beside me, "we need to talk about something." "What is it?" His dark eyes held mine, steady and warm. "It's about Jacob Brown." "Lucy," he cut in gently, "there's something I need to tell you first." "All right," I conceded. "I had a dream," he began, his voice taking on an odd tension. "I saw you married to Jacob Brown." My heart stuttered in my chest. Could he have been reborn too? The thought flickered through my mind like lightning. But as Robert continued speaking, reality settled in. It was just a dream, though one painted with the vivid colors of my past life. Robert's steel-gray eyes, usually so sharp and determined, softened as they met mine. His voice dropped to a whisper, raw with emotion. "Lucy, in all my years, I've never truly feared anything. But when I woke from that dream," he paused, his hands tightening around mine, "the thought of you marrying Jacob terrified me to my core. That's why I rushed to Nanyang, wrapped up everything there at lightning speed. I couldn't bear the thought of being too late." Tears welled up in my eyes, hot and unstoppable. The afternoon sunlight streaming through my office window caught them, turning them to diamonds. "Robert, thank you. Thank you for loving me so deeply." With infinite tenderness, he brushed the tears from my cheeks with his thumb. "Silly woman," he murmured, his voice thick with affection. "What's there to thank me for? It's just us, you and me. Always has been." The warmth of the moment enveloped us, but a nagging question refused to let go. How had Robert come to love me so completely in this life, when we'd never truly met before? After gentle but persistent prodding, he finally revealed the truth. Years ago, when I was barely 15, wearing my hair in 2 simple braids and shadowing my mentor at a medical conference, Robert had seen me. Though I couldn't recall that moment, one of countless faces in a crowded hall, it had burned itself into his memory. "Your beauty caught my eye first," he admitted, a rare blush coloring his cheeks. "But it was more than that. Something about you, I couldn't forget it. Couldn't forget you." My heart clenched painfully sweet at his confession. Here was Robert Brown, the ruthless business tycoon, revealing himself to be a romantic at heart. "I've spent all these years searching," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of time spent alone. "Finding you again, it feels like destiny. Now that I have you, Lucy, I won't ever let go." The intensity in his eyes drew me in as he leaned forward, clearly intending to kiss me. Suddenly remembering where those lips had been earlier, I clapped my hand over his mouth. He pulled back, brown eyes filled with playful hurt. "Wife," he protested softly. "Don't wife me," I said firmly, fighting back a laugh. "You just kissed my foot. Go brush your teeth. 10 times, and I'm counting." "As you wish," he agreed with mock solemnity, heading to the bathroom with an exaggerated bow. It would be 2 weeks before I heard Jacob Brown's name again. By then, I had already submitted my resignation to the clinic, preparing for a new life with Robert in the southern city where his business was headquartered. I was in my office, surrounded by half-packed boxes of medical supplies and personal belongings, when Jasmine White burst through the door, her presence as sudden as a summer storm. The door burst open, and Jasmine White stumbled in, her designer handbag hanging askew. Her perfectly manicured fingers clutched at my arm with surprising strength. Dr. Carter, please, I need your help. Her voice cracked with desperation. Through mascara-smudged eyes, she pleaded, "Can you perform an abortion?" The words hung heavy in the half-packed office. My gaze instinctively dropped to her belly, clearly swollen beneath her expensive blouse. "An abortion? Jasmine, you're nearly 5 months along." I kept my voice steady, professional. "Just reached 5 months," she confirmed, wringing her hands. The afternoon light from my office window cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting her distress. Taking a deep breath, I spoke firmly. "I cannot and will not do that. At this stage, what you're asking for isn't an abortion, it's induced labor. It's completely out of the question." Tears spilled down her cheeks, smearing her careful makeup. "Dr. Carter, I know I've said terrible things to you before. I was crazy with jealousy. Please don't hold that against me now." Her knees started to buckle. "I'll beg if I have to." As she began to sink to the floor, memories of my past life flashed through my mind. The anger, the bitterness that had partially led to my death. Yet looking at her now, that past life rage seemed distant, almost trivial. "Stand up," I said, reaching for her arm. "If you have something to say it on your feet." "I won't rise until you agree to help me." Her voice was steel beneath the tears. "Then stay down." I turned back to my packing, refusing to participate in her drama. The sound of cardboard scraping against cardboard filled the tense silence. She scrambled to her feet, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum as she followed me. "It's Jacob. Jacob Brown is in trouble." I paused, turning slowly. Though I'd anticipated Jacob's downfall, I needed to hear the details. "Someone reported him for going AWOL," she rushed on, words tumbling out. "They investigated, confirmed everything. 3 years in prison, and his railway bureau position," she made a falling gesture with her hand. "Gone, just like that." Her eyes, ringed with smeared coal, fixed on mine. "I can't let this child grow up with a father behind bars, and I won't let it destroy my life either." She stepped closer, her perfume cloying in the small space. "Please," as one woman to another, looking at her desperate determination to abandon both Jacob and their unborn child, something inside me snapped. "Do you have any idea how deeply Jacob loves you?" My voice was quiet but intense. "He loves you enough to die for you. He even dreams of being buried beside you, of finding you again in his next life." Jasmine's perfectly shaped lips curled into a sneer. "Love?" She spat the word like poison. "Love doesn't pay the bills or keep you comfortable." Her cold pragmatism, even in this crisis, sparked a reluctant admiration in me. But before I could respond, chaos erupted in the hallway. Thundering footsteps, angry voices growing louder. The door flew open again, this time revealing Jacob Brown's parents, their faces dark with fury. Behind them crowded a mass of relatives, aunts clutching their purses like weapons, uncles with stern faces, cousins craning their necks to see inside. The small office suddenly felt like a courtroom, with Jasmine and me at its center. The Browns descended like an angry storm. They surrounded Jasmine, their voices rising and crashing against each other like waves. Jacob's mother, her face flushed with fury, jabbed a finger at Jasmine's belly. "Don't you dare think about getting rid of my grandson!" "Dr. Carter, please." Jasmine's fingers dug into my arm, her expensive rings cold against my skin. But there was nothing I could do as the Brown family swept her away, their combined will an unstoppable force. Standing in the aftermath of their departure, surrounded by my half-packed office, I found myself lost in thought. Unless something dramatic happened, Jasmine would be forced to carry the child to term. A chill ran through me as I remembered her fate in my past life, a congenital heart condition that had claimed her in her early 40s. Would this Jasmine survive childbirth? Despite our complicated history, I found myself offering a silent prayer for both mother and child. My hand unconsciously drifted to my chest as a familiar ache bloomed there. Could it be possible? Could Jacob and Jasmine's unborn child be the soul of my son from our previous life? The thought both comforted and pained me. In that other lifetime, Jacob and our son had dreamed of creating their perfect family with Jasmine, a dream that seemed both fulfilled and twisted by fate's cruel sense of humor. Looking out my office window, I watched the setting sun paint the city in shades of amber and gold. Jacob's path ahead would be far from smooth. He was no longer the powerful, wealthy man of our past life, but rather a fallen officer facing imprisonment. Yet wasn't that the nature of karma? We all must pay the price for our deepest desires, one way or another. Warm fingers intertwined with mine, pulling me back to the present. Robert stood beside me, his presence solid and reassuring as we watched the sun sink behind the city skyline. "Lucy," he said softly, his voice carrying all the weight of past lives and future promises, "from this moment until our last breath, I'll be by your side." A smile spread across my face as I squeezed his hand. The warmth of the fading sunlight matched the glow in my heart. "Robert," I whispered, "may we fill every moment of our future with joy and understanding." As darkness settled over the city, I realized that some dreams die so others can be born. In this life, I had found my way back to where I truly belonged, not trapped in the shadow of past regrets, but standing beside the man who had loved me across time itself.